Maya Torrence was just 17, full of dreams and ready to leave her small town behind. Bryce Keller, 19, was the boyfriend everyone warned her about, a jealous, controlling young man who once stood in her mother's kitchen and promised, "I'll never hurt her." Just 4 days later, he stood over Maya's body and pumped bullets into her as neighbors watched in horror. How did a vow of protection turn into a death sentence? Stay with us, because this is one of the most disturbing cases you'll ever hear. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into true crime. It started in the kind of town where nothing ever seemed to change, where neighbors waved across fences and gossip traveled faster than the wind. In the middle of that quiet place lived Maya Torrence, a 17-year-old girl who had her whole future waiting for her. She was bright, hopeful, and eager to step into adulthood, but like so many young women her age, she had fallen for someone who would eventually destroy her. His name was Bryce Keller, 19, already drifting through life with no clear purpose. While Maya saw him as exciting, her mother saw something else entirely, a ticking time bomb. From the moment he began dating her daughter, Maya's mother noticed the warning signs. Bryce was moody, quick to anger, and always wanted to control where Maya was, who she spoke to, and even what she wore. There were whispers around town about his past, fights at parties, stolen items from stores, a car crash that nearly killed him after a night of drinking. Still, Maya insisted that what they had was real love, that he just needed someone who believed in him. Mothers know their children better than anyone else, and she knew in her heart that Bryce was trouble. The tension between Maya's mother and Bryce came to a head one spring evening. The house was filled with the faint smell of dinner cooking, and the air felt heavy as the two stood face to face. For a long time, Maya's mother had kept her fears to herself, trying not to push too hard, afraid that telling her daughter to leave him might drive her further into his arms. But after seeing bruises she could no longer ignore, she finally confronted him. She told Bryce directly that she was terrified of what he might do. She made it clear that her daughter's safety was her greatest concern. Bryce stood there, his jaw tight, eyes cold but steady. He didn't raise his voice or lash out like he usually did when challenged. Instead, he made a promise. He looked at Maya's mother and swore that he would never hurt Maya. His words were firm, deliberate, as if rehearsed. For a brief moment, it brought a fragile sense of relief. A mother desperately wanted to believe that this boy, who held her daughter's heart, could be trusted. But deep down, something still felt wrong. Promises can soothe fears, but they don't erase instincts. And her instincts told her that Bryce's temper was a storm waiting to break. She spent that night restless, replaying his words in her head, wondering if she had done enough. Maya, on the other hand, brushed it all off, claiming that her mother was worrying too much. To Maya, the promise was enough proof that Bryce cared. What none of them realized was that this moment, this fragile truce, was not a turning point toward safety. It was the calm before a tragedy. Because Bryce's promise was not made to protect Maya, it was made to keep suspicion away. And in less than a week, that vow would be broken in the most brutal way imaginable. The promise Bryce made should have brought peace, but instead it marked the beginning of a darker turn. In the days that followed, the cracks in his mask grew more visible. Maya's friends began to notice how tense she seemed whenever her phone buzzed, how quickly she glanced over her shoulder as though she was being watched. Bryce's jealousy had always been there, simmering beneath the surface, but now it was out in the open, an obsession that clung to every moment they spent together. He demanded to know where she was at all times. If she didn't answer his calls within minutes, he accused her of lying. If she laughed with friends, he accused her of hiding something from him. Maya tried to hold on to the image of the boy she had first fallen for, the one who had charmed her with late-night drives and whispered promises of forever, but that boy seemed to vanish more each day. What remained was someone unpredictable and frightening. The bruises on her arm, the ones she claimed were accidents, told their own story. Even when her friends urged her to break free, Maya's voice would lower to a whisper as she said she believed he could change. She was convinced that his anger was just a sign of how much he cared, how terrified he was of losing her. Her mother noticed the signs too. She saw how her daughter's light was dimming, how her laughter had become rare. Still, Maya refused to let go. The fragile hope of love was stronger than the fear building inside her. And for Bryce, that hope was a weapon he could use to keep her exactly where he wanted her. The breaking point came one night when Maya attended a graduation party. It should have been a celebration, a night of joy and excitement for the future, but it became the spark that lit Bryce's rage. When he found out she had gone without him, his fury erupted. He drove around searching for her, calling repeatedly, each unanswered ring fueling his paranoia. To him, the idea that she could be enjoying herself without him was unbearable. He convinced himself she was betraying him, even though there was no truth to it. By the time Maya returned home, the atmosphere had shifted into something dangerous. Bryce was waiting, his anger boiling over. Neighbors later recalled hearing raised voices echoing into the night, the kind of shouting that made people freeze in place, unsure whether to intervene. For Maya, it was another night of trying to calm the storm, another night of convincing herself that tomorrow would be better. But for Bryce, it was no longer just an argument. His obsession had passed the point of no return. Every warning sign was there, his controlling behavior, his paranoia, his escalating outbursts, but no one could predict just how far he was willing to go. The promise he had made only 4 days earlier was already unraveling, and in the silence of that small town, the tragedy that lay ahead was moving closer with each passing hour. The night of the shooting began like any other in the quiet neighborhood where Maya lived. The streets were dimly lit, and most houses had already gone dark as families settled into bed. But inside Maya's driveway, the tension that had been building for days finally exploded. Bryce had arrived uninvited, his car parked crookedly at the curb, headlights casting long shadows across the front yard. He was pacing, fists clenching and unclenching, waiting for Maya to return from the party that had triggered his fury. When she pulled in, tired but unaware of what was about to unfold, the shouting started immediately. Neighbors would later describe hearing the sharp rise and fall of angry voices cutting through the night air. The argument escalated quickly, with Bryce's voice dominating, filled with rage, while Maya's pleas carried a desperate edge. For weeks she had tried to calm his storms, but this one was different. There was no reasoning with him anymore. The fight spilled onto the driveway, and then came the sound that turned fear into horror, the first gunshot. Bryce had pulled a handgun from his waistband, a weapon no one knew he had been carrying. The blast echoed down the street, jolting awake anyone still inside their homes. Maya staggered as the bullet struck, collapsing onto the pavement. But the nightmare didn't end there. Witnesses would later tell investigators that Bryce didn't stop after the first shot. He walked closer, towering over her as she lay helpless on the ground. With chilling precision, he raised the gun again and fired. And again. Each pull of the trigger was deliberate, each shot a violent answer to his twisted obsession. The sound of gunfire rang out in rapid succession, shattering the stillness of the night. By the time the weapon fell silent, Maya's body had been riddled with bullets. Neighbors who had peeked from their windows stood frozen, horrified by what they had just witnessed. Some rushed to call the police, while others stayed crouched behind curtains, too terrified to move. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as emergency vehicles closed in on the scene. But it was already too late. The officers who arrived found Maya lying motionless in her driveway, her life taken in the most brutal way imaginable. Bryce was still there, standing over her, the gun in his hand, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed as though he might turn the weapon on himself, but instead he fled, disappearing into the night before police could stop him. Maya's mother arrived not long after, pulled into the chaos by a frantic phone call from a neighbor. The sight that met her eyes was unbearable. Just days earlier she had begged Bryce to promise her daughter would never be harmed. Now, that same driveway held the broken remains of that vow. The promise meant nothing, and the boy she had feared from the beginning had carried out the very act she had dreaded most. The horror of that night would haunt the community forever, a reminder of how quickly a single moment can destroy an entire future. The hours after the shooting were filled with chaos, but once the sirens faded and the body was taken away, investigators began piecing together the truth. What had looked like a crime of passion was far darker than anyone expected. Detectives searched Bryce's car and bedroom, gathering evidence that painted a picture of a young man who had been planning this act long before he pulled the trigger. The most chilling discovery was a folded sheet of notebook paper left on his passenger seat. On it, Bryce had scrawled disturbing words about how he could never let Maya go, ending with a line that made the blood of seasoned officers run cold. "If she leaves me, no one will ever have her." This single note shifted the entire case. It was no longer just about a heated argument spiraling out of control. It was premeditated. Bryce had gone to Maya's house that night with the intention of killing her. The gun wasn't something he happened to have. It was something he had armed himself with deliberately, knowing what he was about to do. For investigators, the motive soon became clear when they uncovered another devastating piece of the puzzle. While talking to Maya's closest friends, detectives learned she had been planning a way out. She had applied to colleges far from home, hoping to escape the small town and start fresh without Bryce's shadow hanging over her. She had confided in only a few people, asking them not to tell anyone, not even her mother, because she wanted to surprise her family when the acceptance letters came in. Her dream was to leave quietly and build a life free of his control. But Bryce had already found the letters. Hidden inside Maya's backpack was an envelope from a university in another state, congratulating her on her acceptance. When officers discovered the opened letter with his fingerprints on it, the timeline became undeniable. He had read it, understood what it meant, and realized she was slipping away from him. That was the spark that set his obsession ablaze. What haunted everyone most was how calm he had appeared just days earlier when speaking to Maya's mother. He had promised, almost convincingly, that he would never hurt Maya. But the evidence told another story. He was already preparing to make sure Maya could never leave him. The note in his car wasn't written in anger after a fight. It had been written before, proof of a calculated decision. In the courtroom later, prosecutors emphasized this point over and over. They revealed text messages Bryce had sent to friends in the days leading up to the murder. In them, he hinted that if Maya ever betrayed him, he wouldn't be able to control himself. His friends brushed it off as empty talk, never imagining he meant it. But those messages, combined with the letter and the gun, drew a chilling picture of intent. What once seemed like the impulsive actions of a jealous teenager now stood revealed as something far more sinister. Bryce hadn't simply lost his temper. He had planned for this moment, waited for it, and carried it out with ruthless determination. The twist was undeniable. Maya's death wasn't a sudden tragedy. It was the end result of a choice Bryce had made long before that night arrived. The trial that followed was one of the most closely watched cases the small community had ever seen. Courtrooms that usually sat half-empty were filled to capacity as people gathered to hear how a promise had turned into a nightmare. Bryce sat at the defense table, expressionless, dressed in a suit that didn't fit him, his eyes fixed forward as if he were disconnected from the reality of what he had done. For Maya's family, the sight of him sitting there alive, while their daughter lay in the ground, was almost too much to bear. Prosecutors wasted no time in presenting the evidence. They showed the handwritten note found in Bryce's car, his chilling declaration that if Maya left him, no one else would have her. They revealed the text messages to his friends, casual warnings that he would do something drastic if she betrayed him. And most devastating of all, they called neighbors to the stand who recounted, through tears, the horror of watching Bryce stand over Maya and fire shot after shot. Each witness added another layer to the unbearable picture of what had really happened that night. The defense tried to argue that Bryce had acted in the heat of the moment, that his emotions had overwhelmed him, and that he never intended for things to go so far. But the premeditated elements, the note, the gun, the discovery of Maya's college plans, tore that argument apart. This wasn't a crime of sudden rage. It was a decision, carefully nurtured by jealousy and obsession, carried out in cold blood. Throughout the trial, Maya's mother sat silently, clutching a photograph of her daughter, the same picture Maya had taken before her senior dance, her face glowing with youthful excitement. Friends and teachers testified about Maya's future, her acceptance letters, her dreams of studying journalism and traveling the world. The courtroom heard about a girl who had everything ahead of her, stolen away in a driveway by the very person who had sworn to protect her. When the jury finally returned with their verdict, the room was hushed. The foreman spoke the words that sealed Bryce's fate, guilty of first-degree murder. There was no outburst from him, no visible emotion. He simply sat still, as if the weight of the sentence had no meaning. For Maya's family, the verdict brought justice, but not peace. Justice could punish Bryce, but it could not erase the sound of gunfire from that night or the image of a daughter whose life had been cut short. The judge handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Bryce would spend the rest of his days behind bars, a reminder of how jealousy and control can turn lethal. For the community, the case left a scar. Parents held their children closer, friends whispered about the red flags they had ignored, and Maya's name became a warning spoken in classrooms and homes. Never dismiss the signs, never underestimate obsession. For her mother, the pain was unending. The words Bryce had spoken just days before the murder haunted her every night, his promise never to hurt Maya. Those words had been a lie, a mask hiding his darkest intentions. And though the court had delivered justice, she would live the rest of her life with the knowledge that a promise meant to reassure her had instead become the most haunting memory of all.